There are none of us gathered today who have ever lived in a world without the church. That's something. 2,000 years old. But there was a time that there was no church, that there was no kingdom as we know it now. And so this morning we're going to be in Acts chapter 2. We're going to look at the beginnings of that kingdom. This week and next week we'll be taking a look at that, and maybe a few weeks past that. Let me remind us where we've been. 50 days before this group of men that we'll be listening to today were scattered and scared. Their Messiah had been taken in for trial and put to death. 49 days before this, these men had been greeted by the risen Messiah. Talking about the Saturday in between the resurrection, followed by the Sunday of the resurrection. 10 days before Pentecost, they had been challenged to take the message to Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the rest of the world. And then 10 days before, they had watched as their rabbi, their Lord, their Messiah, their friend, had ascended into heaven. And in those 10 days since he had left them, they had been waiting. They did one major thing. They installed Matthias to take the place of Judas, who had betrayed Jesus and then hanged himself. But now it was Pentecost. And the entire world, the history of everything, was getting ready to change. This wasn't just any Pentecost like Passover had been, just any Passover. You can't ever have another Passover like the one where you crucify the Son of God, and you can't have any other Pentecost like the one where the Holy Spirit comes and the kingdom is established. Let me tell you just a little bit about Pentecost. Pentecost was celebrated as the first fruits. It was the time that their harvest started coming in, and all men who were able were required to go to Jerusalem. This was one of those big three celebrations where all the able men were required to get to Jerusalem. It was a time of celebration, a time to say thank you to God for the harvest. A lot of them would have brought with them sheaves of grain that they had grown in their fields, and they would take them to the temple as what they called wave offerings, and they would wave the grain in front of God, and some of that grain then would be roasted as sacrifices before God. When Jesus was crucified 50 days before, his death fell, we believe, on a Friday. He was raised from the dead on a Sunday. And when you count 50 days from that day, you end up at Pentecost. So everything is set. He's told his disciples to go to Jerusalem and wait for the promise. And they are in Jerusalem waiting for the promise when Pentecost comes. Let's start with just the first 4 verses of Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. When the day of Pentecost came, your translation may say, was fully come, they were all together in one place. Suddenly, a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each one of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. And I want us to just take a quick minute to ask the questions, who were these people? Okay. This is not the 120 that are mentioned back in verse 15. This is the 12. These are the apostles. Back up to chapter 1, verse 25, says, We've chosen him to take over this apostolic ministry, which Judas left to go where he belongs. They cast lots. The lot fell to Matthias, so he was added to the 11 apostles. And when the day of Pentecost came, they were all together in one place. The most natural understanding of who the Holy Spirit fell on that day is the 12 apostles. Now, that's not to say that none of this other group ever received a miraculous outpouring of the Holy Spirit. It's not to say none of them ever spoke in tongues. Just that this passage seems to be saying that we're looking at those 12 apostles. So Matthias is instated as an apostle just in time to take part in the amazing sermon that was given on the day of Pentecost. Where were they? It says that it came and it filled the whole house where they were sitting. I don't think they were in that upper room. The upper room was large enough that several of them could meet together, but it wasn't a very public place, and this seems to have been a very public event. All the people who hear it and see it come together to find out what's going on. I believe they're in one of the rooms at the temple. When Herod did his building program over the last 40 some odd years, he had added long rows of pavilions, meeting places around the sides of the temple. And so probably this is where they were. We find out later that there was a particular porch called Solomon's Porch where the church liked to meet. So maybe they were at Solomon's Porch. But it's somewhere public, somewhere accessible, because we find out that at least 3,000 people are listening to this message, probably a great number more. And then the question, what happened to them? It's hard to set aside something this amazing, but set aside for a minute the tongues of fire. Just put them on the back burner. It's a physical manifestation. Don't even get too caught up in the miracle of speaking in tongues, although that's going to be one of the most important parts of what happens that day. And just realize that here is a group of men, some of them just fishermen, some of them who had been tax collectors, some of them who had been part of the Sicarii, the uprising against Rome, the ones that really thought they were doing something political the whole time they were following Jesus, and suddenly they're filled with the Holy Spirit. That's the thing. We need to see that Jesus has fulfilled the promise that he made to them on numerous occasions, but most notably that 10 days ago, you stay in Jerusalem till the gift comes, till the outpouring comes. And here it is. They have received the Holy Spirit. The people of Jerusalem had not been in the presence of the Holy Spirit in a long, long time. They hadn't seen something like the speaking in tongues, something like the tongues of fire that had come down on these men. What does it mean? Why is it so important that the Holy Spirit has come on them in such a mighty way? It says two things. Number one, these men are acceptable. Right? God accepts these people. And as we go through Acts, whenever a new group comes into the kingdom, the question is, where's the Holy Spirit? When the Holy Spirit shows up, you know these people are acceptable. I'll give you one example in particular. When Peter meets Cornelius and the Holy Spirit comes on Cornelius like he's doing here on the Jews, Peter says, how can we reject him? How can we reject these people who have received the Holy Spirit in the same way we did? They have to be acceptable. God has sent the Spirit to them in the same way he sent the Spirit to us. And the other thing is, these guys are authentic. Right? How do you say these aren't people who know what they're talking about? These aren't people who are bearing good witness when you see and hear what's going on the day of Pentecost. So it's a blitzkrieg. It's a lightning warfare from God that says, you better pay attention to this. And the people began to gather around to listen to what Peter and the other apostles have to say. Let's keep reading in verse 5. Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven. When they heard this sound, a crowd came together in bewilderment, because each one heard their own language being spoken. Utterly amazed, they asked, "Aren't all these men who are speaking Galileans? Then how is it that each of us hears them in our own native language? Parthians, Medes, Elamites, residents of Mesopotamia, Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus and Asia, Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and all the parts of Libya near Cyrene, visitors from Rome, both Jews and converts to Judaism." Hang on to that phrase, both Jews and converts to Judaism, "Cretans and Arabs, we all hear them declaring the wonders of God in our own language." Amazed and perplexed, they ask one another, "What does this mean?" Some, however, said, "They've had too much wine." I want you to take special notice of what Luke tells us in these verses, because Jesus has told his apostles, "You're going to be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the earth." On this one day, they include people from most, if not all, of those categories. Right? As you read down through the list, you saw some places that were close by Jerusalem, maybe hadn't taken them just a couple of days to get there. But if you were from Rome and you traveled all the way from Rome to Jerusalem to be there, you probably came in at the time of Passover and just stayed those 50 days until Pentecost. But if you had just come for first fruits, if you were just there for Pentecost, you had made a long, long journey. But every man who was baptized in Jerusalem during the first several years, not just to say the day of Pentecost, but during the first several years of the church's existence, was a circumcised lawkeeper. Every last one of them. There were no Gentiles in this group at all, other than those who had been raised Gentiles but had converted to the law. Right? So we have some Jewish nationals who grew up with the law, and we have some others who were not raised under the law but have accepted and converted to Judaism. Every woman and child that came into the fellowship was connected to the law. Period. Full stop. There are no outsiders. They're all law-keeping Jews or Jewish converts. And as we go on through Acts, we'll see that their habit was to meet at the temple. So once they get larger and larger as a group, they have to have a place to meet. And they didn't have a little church building like we have. They met sometimes in homes, and we'll see that at the end of chapter 2. They spent a lot of time just in fellowship and in mutual encouragement in their homes. But when they came together as a group, they needed a big place. And usually that took place at the temple. In verse 13, kind of gives us a glimpse of a harsh reality. The physical mind has a hard time understanding the Spirit. Some of these people saw Jesus work miracles. Some of these people may have had miracles of Jesus performed on them or on people that they cared about. But it's hard to suddenly decide that these 12 guys from Galilee are imbued with the Holy Spirit and are authoritarian, that they have the right to tell us something. And so we have three different levels very quickly among the group. Number one, there's some that are just questioning. Right? This is where I live my life. I'm always asking questions. I want to know more. If I can prove it one way or the other, fine. But if not, I just love questions. Everything that's presented to me, there's always a question underneath. And some of them said, well, how can this be? Aren't all of these guys that are speaking Galileans, and yet we hear them speaking in our own languages? There are some that are trying to figure things out, and they are moving in a big group to find out more. And then there's this small group who come up with an answer. They think they have figured it out. What's their answer? They're drunk. It's an amazing thing when the Holy Spirit shows up. Tongues of fire descend and sit on them. They're speaking in languages they've never learned, and your explanation is they've had too much wine. The second thing that's really interesting, if you look at the next verse, verse 14, Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice, and said, "Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk, as you suppose. It's only 9 in the morning." Now, it's almost as amazing that Peter, that's his defense, right? It's too early in the day for these men to be drunk, so that can't possibly be the right explanation. The Holy Spirit comes, and your explanation is that these guys must be drunk. And I gave some thought, and maybe you can hash this out in your own mind. Is this blasphemy of the Holy Spirit? You remember when Jesus was casting out demons, and the leadership of the Jews came by and said, well, he's casting out demons by the prince of demons, by Beelzebub. And Jesus says, you can talk bad about me if you want to, but you can't blaspheme the Holy Spirit and find forgiveness. Blasphemy against the Holy Spirit was, here's the Holy Spirit doing something amazing, casting out demons, and you say, it's Satan. Here's the Holy Spirit doing something amazing, giving these men the ability to speak in languages they've never learned, and you say, well, it's because they're drunk. One other thing I'll throw in. Paul, when he's talking about singing in the church, we usually end up with that part down there, speaking to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. But in the beginning of that, he says, don't be full of wine, wherein is excess or dissipation. Don't be full of wine, but speak to one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. His comparison is, when you're drunk, you say stupid stuff. And when you're not drunk, when you're full of the Spirit, you say spiritual things, right? So here's a group of guys that are very earthly in their thinking. And their only explanation is, well, they must be drunk. All right, so I want us to read the sermon all in one fell swoop. I hate to point this out to you, but it's one of the greatest sermons ever preached, and he did it in less than 5 minutes. Now, there's more to the sermon than we have in the book of Acts. It says, with many other words, he testified to them and he encouraged them, but the main points are made in a very short period of time. It doesn't take a long-winded preaching to convert people. Peter, on the first day, with very few words, converts, and they baptize 3,000 people. Beginning in verse 16. This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. Your sons and your daughters will prophesy, your young men will see visions, your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my Spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. I will show wonders in the heavens above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and billows of smoke. The sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Fellow Israelites, listen to this. Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles, wonders, and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. This man was handed over by you and by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death by nailing him to the cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. David said this about him, I saw the Lord always before me. Because he is at my right hand, I will not be shaken. Therefore my heart is glad and my tongue rejoices. My body also will rest in hope, because you will not abandon me to the realm of the dead. You will not let your Holy One see decay. You have made known to me the paths of life. You will fill me with joy in your presence. Fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. But he was a prophet, And he knew that God had promised him on oath that he would place one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing what was to come, he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, that he was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Exalted to the right hand of God, he has received from the Father the promised Holy Spirit, and has poured out what you now see and hear. For David did not ascend to heaven, but he said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Therefore let all of Israel be assured, God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Messiah. Now that's a sermon. The first time that the world knew the full story. The first time the apostles had the opportunity to present the full story was on that Pentecost. And the Holy Spirit came to give them clout, to give them authority, and to give them the message. And this Holy Spirit-inspired message that Peter gives them is heard by over 15 nationalities, all in their own language. Now, the question is, did they hear it? Was that the miracle? Was that everybody could hear in their own language? Kind of like being at the United Nations and everybody has their earphones on and he's speaking in Turkish, but everybody's hearing it in their own language. I think, from what is told us in the very beginning of the chapter, is that the men were speaking the languages and those people were amazed that they were hearing these men speak the languages. Not that the Holy Spirit was changing their hearing, but that the Holy Spirit was changing the apostles' speech. That seems to be the miracle at hand. The apostles are suddenly speaking, coming out of their mouths, are languages that everyone assembled in that place could hear. And Peter reminds them of some things. He reminds them that it was promised a long time ago that God would pour out his Spirit on all flesh. That God would make himself and his Spirit available. And you notice he mentions that it would be both men and women, and even older men and young men. So it's the whole population was going to have the opportunity to have a relationship with God in the Holy Spirit. Joel prophesied long ago, and that's the miracle that you're seeing now, is the beginning of that age, the beginning of that promise being given to you. He reminds them of the ministry of Jesus. For 3.5 years, Jesus traveled all over that area, doing miracles and teaching in ways that nobody had ever heard before, giving them an understanding of what it meant to be in God, part of God, the Son of God, bringing people toward God. And that they, after all of that evidence, had either allowed him to be crucified or had been involved directly in his crucifixion. At the temple on that day may very well have been members of the Sanhedrin, folks who had an absolute hand in killing Messiah, and now suddenly they see the Holy Spirit coming on these Galilean men and hear them speaking in languages they've never learned as they remind the Jewish nation that they just crucified the Son of God. Well, whose fault was it? Peter says, by the influence of the Holy Spirit, you and wicked men have taken and crucified. You may mean the nation of Israel. You may mean the leadership of Israel. Wicked men probably means the Romans, but everyone who was involved in the crucifixion of Jesus could be wrapped up in that blanket of wicked men. And he proclaims Jesus as risen from the dead. And I've always loved this illustration that he uses. He talks about David and how David so confidently affirmed that God would not leave him in Sheol, that he would not let his bones see corruption. David was dead, and his tomb was outside in that area. I mean, you could have walked to David's tomb from where Peter was speaking in less than 2 or 3 minutes, right? If you could make it through the crowds, you just had to go out. It was well marked. Everybody knew it. Peter may have even gestured. I can see him saying it. You know, our patriarch David is dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this very day. And they knew it. But Jesus, whom you crucified, has been raised from the dead, and God has made this Jesus, whom you crucified, both Lord and Christ. J.W. McGarvey explains the two terms this way. He's Lord since he's sitting at the right hand of his Father on the throne of the universe. And all authority has been given to him in heaven and on earth. You remember the Great Commission from Matthew? All authority has been given me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and teach all nations. The marching orders of the Messiah. He's Christ because he's the anointed one. It's the same word as Messiah. I went back and looked at several passages in the Gospels where it could be translated either way. Remember when Matthew records Jesus saying, "Who do people say that I am?" And they say, well, some think you're John the Baptist, and some think you're Elijah, and some think you're one of the other prophets. And Jesus says, well, who do you think I am? And Peter says, we know who you are. You are Messiah, the Son of the living God. Translated into English, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. He was the rightful heir to David's throne over Israel. So the disciples finally got to the point that Jesus was not beginning an earthly kingdom. It finally, day of Pentecost, here they are preaching in somebody else's language. It finally dawns on them exactly what they're supposed to be doing. You're going to go from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria to the uttermost parts of the earth, giving this message of salvation, giving the message of this new kingdom. We're going to stop right there.